took at RAR back in 2019. So some of this may be outdated with what we're dealing with now, it's, you know, but I saved it and I thought it was good information. I would encourage you to take that class at least once. What I have learned, and John, don't report me, I feel like whenever I've taken Mr. Lafayette's classes, they're very technical and not so much practical, okay? Like you'll read this and you'll see that very rarely do we write our addendums, our clauses the way he's got it here. That's not to say this isn't correct. I'm just telling you in practice, you don't always see them written this way. What I want you to take away from this document, and that's the first thing you'll get to, I think he does a good, he has a good example of explaining what you should be thinking about. That's the one thing I definitely want you to take away from this class. You can write anything into a contract, okay? Anything that both people are going to agree to, that's fine. The problem you get into is when it's not specific enough or it doesn't show the consequence if it doesn't happen, okay? That's when people get into trouble. There's also a page, I think it's right behind that, that's something Shannon put together when she taught this a couple years ago. And she always says, be specific and answer the question, if then, okay? Now, not everything is gonna follow a strict if then, but if it's something of importance to your client and it's really like if X doesn't happen, they're not gonna close on the property, then that needs to be your then. Like you need to say what the out is, okay? So read through this from Mr. Lafayette, because he talks about how you come up with stating your situation and thinking through that process of if then, okay? Don't get bogged down by, because he refers to every term that's in our contract. Like he's gonna say in the purchase agreement, on the date of ratification, he's got every term that kind of goes back to one of those terms in our contract. You're probably not gonna write it that way and you're gonna get overwhelmed thinking, I can't remember all those words. But you can remember the premise. I need to say what needs to happen and then what are the options or what's the consequences if this doesn't happen, okay? I thought it was really good that Tommy yesterday, I didn't know that was what he was gonna talk about, that he talked about saving these clauses. You don't wanna keep all this I have folders full of papers that I've saved from when I've taught classes or been to classes. You don't wanna do that? Do it once. Create your clause, save it in Instanet, and I mean, I knew that was an option, I've just never taken the time to do it.
Yeah, that was great.
Take the time to do it, save yourself some time. But that's kind of a general overall concept. Now, knowing that, and I see contracts like this all the time, and they're also written by experienced agents, and I would tell you most of the time the deal closes without a hitch, okay? But tell me if you think this is okay. All parties agree, home inspection is for informational purposes only, period. Have you ever seen that in a contract? Have you ever written that in a contract? Okay, what do you think the problem is?
It's too vague.
Too vague?
You have to say, that, the purchaser won't ask for any repairs or credits.
Right, and it can say a lot of different things, okay? But the problem I see with that, and this is where experienced agents, and they get away with it all the time, so they do it all the time. They're experienced, they've talked to the other agent, they kind of know that both parties are in agreement, we're gonna get this deal done, hey, we're not gonna ask for any repairs. And usually the seller takes it that way. The seller takes it at, when they see that in a contract, hey, they're gonna just check the house out, but they're gonna buy it no matter what, and they're not gonna ask me to do anything or give them a credit. That's the way the seller interprets that. The buyer may either get cold feet and just want out of the deal when they find out there's really $20,000 worth of repairs, or they don't have that money, but they may think, well, I can still negotiate that later. That's where you run into the problem. The two parties don't interpret it the same way. And when it's that vague, and I tell you, it happens all the time and it closes. People know that, well, that's what it means, we're gonna check it out. But it really means nothing. It just says, it's just a statement.
Just the thought I had, because Virginia is unique in having the HOA clause. Even if the seller thinks that they're not gonna be asked for anything, the buyer can ask for something and then use the HOA clause to get out of the deal.
Yeah, that's a whole, yeah, that's a different scenario. I always tell people when you're negotiating a contract and you run into a don't tell your buyers this up front. Buyers are always like, how can I get out of this? We're not in the business of getting people out of contracts. We want the deal to go forward. But anytime there is an HOA in place, if anything, if the wind blows the wrong way and she decides, I don't wanna buy this house because of the way the wind blew today, if there's an HOA, they just have to say when they get that packet, sorry, don't want the house. They don't have to tell you why, they don't have to tell you what you don't like. So you lose time trying to keep a deal together. If somebody has really made up their mind they're not gonna buy a house and there's an HOA, you may as well tell your seller, go ahead and release them, we're just wasting time, okay? So that's just one example of people think, and especially when, you can apply that to like the whole inspection waiver, the appraisal, all that crazy business we were doing the last couple years. People got so used to doing it and they're rolling and they would just write things in saying, well, they know what we mean, everybody knows what we mean. And then you run into a sticking point and there's nothing. And then you've got two parties, one wants to close, one doesn't, and you have nothing to hold their feet to the fire, okay? So the better way to do that, and there's several examples in here, is to say something to the effect, like Justin said, you can actually say, we will not ask, now you gotta realize, just because you put something in there, your job is to protect the person you're representing, okay? So if you're representing the buyer, I would recommend you put in there, we will not ask for repairs or credits, because that is what you're kind of saying when you're doing that. However, if the purchaser at their sole discretion is dissatisfied with the inspection, we reserve the right to terminate and get our deposit back. Now the seller might not like that, but that's what you need to have in there to protect your client. Because that's what the buyer's thinking. The buyer's thinking, yeah, I'm checking it out, and if we just find some little stuff, I'm not gonna ask him to fix anything, but daggone it, there's a crawl space problem, he's fixing it or I'm not buying the house. Well, that's not what it says, okay? So you always have to know really where people are coming from. Now you will come across the occasional investor, and they don't care. They're gonna buy it no matter what, but you need to make it as tight as you can to protect your client. Like, so the seller's gonna receive that and they may say, well, no, I don't wanna give them a way out. That's negotiation, you gotta figure it out. Same with that as-is addendum, because that's basically what the as-is addendum says, okay? It says, we're allowing you 10 days to do any and all inspections. And if you don't like what you find out, you can walk away with no consequence. I recommend using that as-is addendum because it has all the language in there. But then you can change that too, because people say, well, maybe we are willing, or maybe we will do X, Y, Z. Okay, modify it. Again, it's whatever the two parties agree to in writing. Because that as-is addendum says the seller is doing literally nothing. They're not doing well on septic, they're not doing termite. Sometimes the seller's still willing to do that, so you can just mark that part out of the as-is addendum and have it initialed off. Yes, sir.
So I recently sold a house, a personal property, and I had what I thought was an as-is addendum in it. I didn't read the wording fine tune. I just, authenticized everything and was like, get it sold. And we had a buyer. They did an inspection for informational purposes, and then they came back and were like, hey, the inspection, there's a bunch of things wrong, and they want $6,000 towards repairs. And I talked to my realtor and was like, what was the point of the for informational purposes only, or the as-is addendum,
right,
when they're gonna come ask me for a credit anyways? And he was like, well, you don't have to give it to them, but they can walk away. And it's like, well, even if the inspection isn't for informational purposes and they intend to do a full inspection, and they ask you for repairs, they can walk away anyway. So what do you gain by having an as-is addendum or a information?
Well, the as-is
purchase
addendum
agreement?
has that clear language, and it lets both parties know up front, we're gonna check it out. If we don't like it, we can be released, no consequences to anybody, and we get our money back, our deposit back.
Right.
Okay, and so if you're representing the seller, what you tell them in that case, okay, you're tying your house up for 10 days. Are you okay with that? Now, in a slow market, maybe you are. In a fast market, maybe you're not, or vice versa. It just all depends on people's circumstances. Where we got into trouble, and I don't want to jump around too much between my papers, they changed our contract a few years back. Y'all know what I'm talking about when I say the optional box that's in paragraph 16? And I've got a copy of it in here for you somewhere in one of these attachments. Basically, that was sort of a modified as-is. People thought it was too much trouble, I guess, to attach an as-is addendum, which had all the right language. So there's this optional box. And most people agree, sellers don't like to see it because it basically says we're doing an informational inspection, but we reserve the right to get out.
Right.
Now that does protect your buyer, and I do think you need something to protect your buyer, and the seller just has to understand.
Yeah.
Your agent should have explained that up front.
Right.
And you heard what he said. He said he signed it without reading it, and he did it authenticized. If you've taken my contract class, what do I tell you? If you send something by authenticized, you still have to be on the phone with your client reading through every paragraph with them, okay? Don't just send it over to authenticized. So people just got lazy thinking, well, our industry norm is an informational purposes inspection means XYZ. And you just can't assume that, okay? That's what I need you to take away. You can't assume that. It needs to be spelled out. Now, Blakely had a situation just like that. It was an as-is addendum. You can always renegotiate anything, okay?
Right.
His client did the as-is inspection. It was more than they inspected, but they still were willing to buy the house, but if they got it at a lesser price.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with them coming back, then a new negotiation. And it all has to happen in that 10-day period that was either written in your clause or was in that as-is addendum. You say, hey, we found a little more than we were thinking. If you'll knock the price down by 10 grand, we'll still move forward. Seller can say yes, because they want to get it sold. Seller can say no. The one thing the as-is addendum, it protects you a little bit, but if they do a regular home inspection, they do provide the seller with the inspection report.
Right.
Once you, as a seller and listing agent, have that report, now these are known defects that you're gonna have to disclose to the next person. So that factors into your decision-making process, okay? If I now know that I've got a crappy crawl space, the next buyer, I'm gonna have to tell them that, and there's a good chance they're gonna want me to fix it, and they might even try to take more off the price. So do I want to go ahead and either fix it or knock the price down by the 10K or whatever it is? So it's all about having the information, making the decision.
Right.
Okay, but people just get lazy and they think, well, everybody assumes informational purposes means this, and I see it all the time, one sentence, period. And then I'm getting the call, well, seller doesn't want to release them, but we found 15 grand of stuff and she doesn't want to buy it now. Sorry, you didn't give an out. You know, you didn't say any of that. And then it just becomes a battle.
Right.
And there's plenty of times we let people out of contracts when legally we don't have to, because you just decide it's not worth the battle. I'm gonna move on to the next person, okay?
In a hot market like this, can a seller say, yeah, no home inspection?
Seller
the
can
price
say
is the
whatever they
price.
want. You just
Yeah.
gotta find the right buyer who's willing to
Right.
agree to your terms.
Right.
I haven't looked at the as-is addendum in a long time, I haven't needed to. And I seem to remember when it first came out, there's 2 paragraphs here, and you did one paragraph or the other, but there's no check boxes here. Are
Mm.
both of these paragraphs in force, and
Yes.
do they complement each other
Yes.
then?
Yes. They talk about different inspection, and that's why I said you can modify them. Like, I think the second one addresses the well and septic specifically, and I've seen it where that's scratched out, like Mr. Byers said, I still want you to do the well and septic, that kind of thing.
So if you wanted to favor one over the other, you would simply scratch out and initial the other paragraph, right?
Mm-hmm. And you can change that however you want, but, yeah. All right, so the first handout I gave you, that I would read through it. He gives lots of different examples. Again, it's a little more wordy than you're probably gonna use, but he gives you examples of all these different scenarios that pop up. Because you can write something in other terms for anything. Like one of the examples in here is about personal property. And you, sometimes those are ones that you can sometimes get away with not really having that if then. But if it's something important, put a then in there, like seller to remove all the tires from the backyard by closing. Okay, that sounds like you're just agreeing to this term, right? Well, then you get to closing and the seller hasn't removed them and he's realized it's gonna be a bigger deal than he thinks. You're stuck again, unless you've already written in, okay? If not performed within X days, buyer reserves the right to terminate the contract. Not saying you have to, hopefully you can still work it out. That's the job of the realtors, to work it out and get people to be reasonable, all right? But those are the kind of things that people think it's just simple. The same thing about leaving some personal property. You know, you're gonna leave the swing set or you're gonna leave the washer and dryer. Your client may have to decide, is it worth not closing over? Sometimes we've had to look at a buyer and say that and say, okay, you are 100% right. They were supposed to leave that swing set and they've taken it. We can hold closing up and fight them for the swing set, or we can move ahead to closing. If you do, you're giving up the right to get the swing set. You know, so there, we cannot. I have one agent who he worries himself to death because he wants to anticipate every possible problem that can come up. And he wants to write something in the contract to protect his client for every possible scenario that comes up. It ain't possible. You know, you've got to hit the big things and you've got to make it as tight as possible on the things that matter. But we can't predict what people are gonna do 30 days down the road, okay? But if it's something important that you know your client's not going to want to close over, then it needs to be in there. Or if there's monetary, you know, cost associated with it. All right, so read through that. It's got lots of examples. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time doing exact phrases. We'll do a few. And I wanna see if y'all have a specific question. But the next page, the 2-page form, the do's and don'ts, the examples. This is the one that Shannon put together. Because you do want to protect your client. This one about inspection, like waiving part of it or putting limits on it. This is one thing that came out of the crazy market that I love. Because usually, what's a seller's biggest concern when somebody wants to do a home inspection? What do they say?
It's gonna cost me so much money.
Gonna cost, or what is it? What they're gonna nickel and dime me to death. I'm gonna get somebody who wants me to fix every little thing, right? I like using some of these limiting inspections even now because it lets them know, like if you write, all parties agree buyer will not request any repairs with a cost to cure estimate of $500 or less, but retains all other rights, see paragraph 16. And you can write it a bunch of different ways. Sometimes you can take the whole thing out of paragraph 16. You can say, or just say all other items of paragraph 16 apply. Because paragraph 16 is your inspection paragraph, which talks about the negotiation period and the right to terminate if you can't come to terms and all of that, okay? But the reason I like something like this is you're saying, Mr. Seller, yes, we want to check the house out. And if we find something major, we're gonna want the right to negotiate that with you. But if we find a leaky faucet, a loose toilet, all those things that inspectors love to write up and stick a price of like $250 on, we're not worried about that. We realize the house is 15 years old and it's gonna have normal wear and tear. So to me, that's a good way to let, if you're representing the buyer, to let the seller know, hey, we want to protect my client and check out the house, but we're not gonna nickel and dime you. And she's got other examples on here. I've seen some people even write, I think this is getting it all depends how much risk your buyer's willing to take. Because they've got one on here that we're only gonna negotiate if it's a mechanical system. Well, to me, that's a little vague. how much of the system is messed up that we're gonna call it a mechanical system problem. So I like doing a specific dollar amount for item. Some people, I think Tommy in his example yesterday, he does we'll waive the first $5,000 of inspection. That's another way to do it. You need to understand the difference. I can tell when I'm talking on the phone to some of my agents, they're going, but they don't understand the difference. If you're working with a buyer who is really cost conscious because they just don't have but so much money to work with, make sure they understand, yes, it'll be more attractive to the seller if we say we're gonna waive everything under $500, but I want you to realize, how old was the house you sold, Jack?
1947.
Yeah, this is a 1947 house. I can guarantee you the inspection report is gonna come back with, could be $10,000 worth of $500 items. It's gonna be, what did yours look like? You said you got through it. Was it a bad inspection or had they?
No, it was actually pretty good, other than the sewer line.
Okay.
It has to be completely repaired, and there's post powder beetles in the crawl space.
Okay, so some big things. But just make sure your client understands the inspector's job is to inform you, and they are gonna write up every little thing. And because of the cost of getting a contractor out, you might have one contractor come and do 4 items and it only cost you $600, but they're gonna write each of those up at $300 or $400 because that's what it would be if you came out and did that one item. So just make sure they understand, if this report comes in, and I don't care what the bottom number is, if every single item on that page is below whatever dollar amount we've selected, you're taking the house, okay? And sometimes they may go, ooh, I'm not so sure I wanna do that, or let's lower the amount, let's say $250, so that's really getting the nickel and dime stuff out, but like $500 could be a hot water heater, you know? So you need to understand what the terms mean and let your client decide what risk they're willing to take. In Tommy's example, if they're waiving $5,000, gives you a little freedom to negotiate. If that report comes in at $10,000, then you can pick out the $5,000 worth of things that don't really matter to you. That's what you're waiving, and then you negotiate on the other 5 that's on there. Okay, so you need to understand that and be able to explain it. Same with appraisal gap. All right, who in here, I see a lot of brand new agents, but who has not written a contract at all? Okay. Have the rest of you, has anybody written one with an appraisal gap waiver in it? Justin has? Okay. You've gotta understand what that means. That's another one that people got sloppy with when the market was crazy. We waive appraisal, okay? What does that mean to you? If you got a contract that said we are waiving appraisal, what do you think the seller takes that as?
You got cash.
Pay the price no matter what it comes in at.
Right. So you got extra cash to work with, and if you offered 300 and it appraises for 250, you got 50,000 in cash on top of your 10% down payment to make the 250 loan, right? You got all the cash needed. Verify that. Talk to the loan officer. The client may say, they may not understand. As much as you try to explain it, they may not understand. So when I was working with a buyer who had limited cash, every weekend we were making an offer and we were deciding how much could we waive on appraisal. And it all depended on the sales price. Some weekends we could waive 5,000, some it was 7,500, because we were kind of using all her funds, because she was buying during that time where I think we wrote 7 contracts before she ever got a house, and she was usually going up against 10 to 20 offers each time in a 250 price point. So we had to find the right match. Make sure they understand what that means, okay? Also, let your client know, if you're getting a loan, the bank is still going to do an appraisal, all right? It just means you're gonna pay the price regardless what that appraisal says. The only time you should ever mark I'm waiving the appraisal and it means one's not being done is if they're paying cash, okay?
And you still have to have them go to like town first to be qualified to verify they have the cash.
Well, they wouldn't go to town first, you just ask for a proof of funds,
Okay,
okay? That's a whole nother thing that people get sloppy on. Proof of funds has to be in their name, okay, has to be liquid. I always, like, sometimes people will bring me their investment accounts. I always ask the question, all right, how quick can you get this money? Like, is it one of those where it's gonna take 45 days to get your funds out? You know, cause I'm not real savvy on what type of investments, but I'm like, you've gotta have this money in 30 days. And if not, I've even had some people write in, we're using this account, funds should be available on this date. You know, I get as specific as I need to let the seller. But it can't be Uncle Joe's money, it can't be your mom and dad's money. They could get ticked off at you before closing and then you don't have it. It has to be your money. The other thing is, people think if they're not getting a mortgage loan, it's cash, but they're using a hard money lender. We've had deals held up because of that. The hard money loan does not come through as expected. That's not cash. That, you would mark that box as an other type of loan, okay? But for appraisal gap, you need to understand what you're saying, and you can cover, and some people do have enough money, they're like, yeah, we're just getting a loan because it's back in a year ago, it was free money. Why should I take all my money out of my account? I'm gonna borrow part of it, but I'm gonna pay, I got enough to pay whatever. Some people that was the case. Other people, no, they were getting that loan and they might have just a little extra to float a difference, okay? So that's the way you would write that. We see a lot of seller rent backs, okay? Because people are having trouble finding where they wanna go. So I always recommend using a form that's out there. So go through Instinet and get familiar with, I mean, I know there's a gazillion, but think about the type of things that come up. There's a possession by seller agreement. I would say use it. If all of it doesn't apply, mark out what doesn't apply or leave it blank. Like, you don't have to charge them. You don't have to get a deposit, but it's got the other legal language that protects you about if you're not out on the day you're supposed to get out, these are my options. You know, it's not just open-ended. And sometimes when you start writing your own little phrases and clauses, you leave it a little too open-ended, okay? But a 7-day rent back for free, see the attached possession after closing agreement. All parties agree that the ring system will convey and the seller will provide the code. I've never seen something written that specifically, but I had it happen on it, so it's probably good that they wrote that in. Get familiar with her do's and don'ts page. We've already talked about this one a little bit. Don't say all parties agree that they'll remove the junk behind the shed. Instead say, we'll remove these items, including this, and by a date. And I would even add, you know, and buyer reserves the right. Maybe you still wanna buy the house, but you're gonna, put in that you're gonna charge them for it. You know, if not done by closing, purchaser will have it removed and charge seller or something like that. That's getting really specific. That's one of those where you're trying to anticipate every little thing. But I would at least put something in there about giving you a way out if it's something really important. Be specific about your repairs when you're asking for those. Read her little paragraph at the bottom. The ultimate test is if someone who was not a party to the transaction, if they hadn't heard your conversations with the other agent, they didn't have your texts and emails, would they be able to pick up what was written on that paper and interpret what was supposed to happen? If you can't answer that question with yes, it happened, so we're doing this, or no, it didn't happen, so we're doing this, then you don't have tight enough language. Okay, so that's just kind of a good overall thing to remember. All right, let's go to, I think the next thing you should have is contingency sale clause. Haven't seen this one a whole lot while things were super duper hot. I have seen a few of these, and you will start to see more of them when they start staying on the market a little bit longer. You could have a contingency sale clause that just says, It's contingent upon the successful settlement of the purchaser's current home located at this address, which is under contract and scheduled to close on this date. You would use that if you're representing a buyer who they've already sold their house, it's pending, it's under contract, but it hasn't closed, okay? Sellers, and especially builders, are usually willing to accept that because they're only tying their house up for a little bit of time. Cause I would add something there too about, you know, if it hasn't closed by this date, this reverts to a first right of refusal. Do any of you all in here even know what a first right of refusal is? Justin?
Yes.
So, do you wanna explain? Since
I
you're
mean,
the
I
most
think you're better
experienced
off
in here.
explaining. It's like,
Alright, I
so
will.
shit or get off the pot, right? I mean, you've got 72 hours.
Yeah.
To,
Yeah.
you know, if you're buying a home, and you're contingent, that purchase is contingent on you selling your home, that home that you're buying, they can continue to market the property and find another buyer. And if they do find another buyer, then if you have the right of first refusal, you have 72 hours to complete that purchase or remove the contingency to allow the sale to go to the other
Right.
party.
So, the first one is one of those open-ended situations. In some situation, builders and some sellers are willing to accept just that contingency. If I was the listing agent and I got a contract that says, this is contingent on the settlement of our home, well, I'm gonna talk to the agent on that other deal, like, hey, are you through inspection? Are you through appraisal? I may even talk to the loan officer and just say, is the loan looking good? Like, is this, I try to do my due diligence to see if it's a solid deal, okay? And if it is, and we know, oh yeah, they've got it priced right, it was, you know, they're through all these steps, they're just waiting for the loan to close, then I may be willing to accept that. But that's a little more risk for the seller to take because it just says it's contingent upon the closing. It doesn't say when it has to close by or we're gonna move on, all right? But if you added, if it hasn't sold, if the first house hasn't sold by this date, then it reverts to a first right of refusal. And the first right is just what Justin explained. That is saying, we've got your contract and we're under contract with you, but we're gonna continue seeing if any other people wanna buy it. When we get another contract, we accept that contract, okay? But we write in there, subject to the removal of the existing first right of refusal. And at the same time, we send that first agent a notice, and that's what all the forms are that are attached here. You send them a notice saying, hey, we've received another offer. Can you move forward? You have your 72 hours to move forward. And the only way they can do that is to sell their house. If they can't get it closed in 72 hours, or get sometimes they will accept the contract or get it under contract, then you release that one and you are under contract with the new buyer, okay? I know it's very confusing until you're in it, but the forms help. A lot of times people try to just write that in. Again, this is one of those situations where I recommend using the form. That's why I said on here, if you have not used the notice forms, then use this language. But the three forms are, the first one is the right of first refusal. That's the one that would come in with that contract, okay? It says, hey, we need to sell our house. When you get another contract, you give us 72 hours to let you know if we can move forward or not. That's what the second form is, when the seller says, hey, I've received this contract, get back to me, can you move forward, yes or no? And then the third one is where the buyer sends it back saying, yes, we can move forward and this is why. We're either closing on this date or we've got a new contract, or no, we can't move forward, okay? If you're brand new and this comes up, this is one of those times you need your manager to help you, okay? Don't try to wing it on your own. Yes?
Might be a dumb question, but I don't know everything about yet. if you've listed a house, and I'm gonna have to think about my question, cause
Okay.
I'm having trouble assembling it, I'll
Okay.
ask you after.
That's fine, that's fine. But that's definitely one that you need guidance on, and you may need help explaining it to your client as well. Not gonna see that all the time, even right now, because I think there's still enough demand. But it has come up, I've seen a couple of them, and sometimes you will see it on new construction, okay? All right. Not gonna go into this one, cause you've got the handout here. This is the one that we were really hammering last year, multiple offers and escalator clauses. This kind of tells you what to write in, but again, I like using the form. The form spells it out, and the thing you need to be careful of is make sure you're clear on, are we comparing offers gross, like just on the sales price, or net? Again, that was kind of moot because nobody was asking for closing costs, but now you are seeing that some people are asking for it. So just make sure you're clear. Are we comparing the net offers, which is usually what people do, and that's what our hometown form says. But I've also got language on here. If you choose not to use the form, there's an example of what kind of language to use there.
We should use the hometown one, right?
Yes.
Because then we have that situation a few months ago where,
The VAR one
Yeah.
is gross, and the
Yeah.
hometown one is net.
but then wasn't there something else that popped up on the VAR one that gave the seller an out, or it was some weird language in there that Rodney presented at one of the sales meetings.
Yeah, I can't remember what it
Yeah.
was, so just use the hometown
Just use
form.
the hometown one, yeah.
Just use the hometown form. I think the biggest thing was the net, but I forget what the other one was. All right. We've kind of talked about a lot of these. I've got a whole packet here. We kind of jumped to this without looking at it. This is on the inspection stuff. I give you an example of how to put the language if you're waiving the first dollar amount or if you're waiving individual items. I've included the language. This is something else. This excludes sections F and G, which are the termite and well and septic. Those are separate inspections. But this is just being very clear that we're not referring to those. We're just referring to the home inspection. Talks about the as-is. One form I want you to look at, because you probably will be using it more, is the actual repair addendum that's behind it, okay? I was trained in, even just 10 years ago, the way Blakely did it, we didn't use a fancy form. We wrote an repair addendum, which basically had the same language as the top paragraph of this. It says, we've done our home inspection, this is what we found, all work is to be performed by a licensed contractor. It gave a deadline of when it had to be done, talked about the final walkthrough, blah, blah, blah. You can do that. Again, use a form. If the form exists, use the form. This one is a little confusing because it gives you a bunch of options. John was talking about the other one with boxes. You may have been thinking about this one. Because item 1 says we're going to request repairs. And we're either gonna waive them, or this is where you would then ask for the things you wanted fixed. Paragraph 2 says we're waiving the right to request a closing cost credit. We're gonna ask for repairs. So they're kind of mutually exclusive, like either we're gonna ask for repairs and we're not gonna ask for a credit, but you can do both. And that's what you would use the other section for, okay? Like maybe there is one big specific repair you want addressed. In that case, I would mark in paragraph 1, we're requesting this repair, and you write in as specific as you can. Like don't just say, fix the crawl space. You know, their idea of what needs to be fixed versus yours could be very different. That's where you get your estimates from your different inspectors, and you say, install the vapor barrier, dry up the water, treat the powder post beetles, post powder beetles, whatever. You write it in specifically what you want done. But then you could come over here and other and say, also getting a credit of $2,000 for some of the piddly items, okay? I'm still unsure, cause like Tommy said yesterday, he does any kind of credit in lieu of repairs on a separate addendum that the lender does not see. The
Yeah.
lender just sees an addendum that says closing costs are increased to this, or sales price is this. People use this form all the time and I've never heard of it being a problem. So I would just talk to your loan officer if you're representing the buyer. They're your friend, you don't have to, it's not being sneaky, just say, hey, we are gonna get a closing cost credit for repairs. And they may tell you, yeah, just put it on a separate addendum. You would still, I say, do this form with the buyer and seller, so you've got it spelled out, this is what we're doing. But then you prepare another addendum that just says, seller agrees to pay $2,500 in closing costs. To me, it's stupid, because when a lender sees that, he knows what's happening, you know, it may not say the words in lieu of repairs, but they know what's happening. But I think some lenders do like to see it that way. I've got the copy of the as-is addendum in here. I gave you all this paper just so you would be aware that all these forms exist. Alright, another not so rare, but less common is on this miscellaneous form, underground oil tanks. If you are representing a buyer, buying a house with an underground oil tank, I recommend putting this language in there. Basically, it says, we want the tanks it's putting all the risk on the seller. Now, they may not agree to it, but I would say if you're trying to represent your buyer well, I would ask for this first and see what you can come up with. All tanks to be properly inspected. If it's found to be leaking, it must be reported and addressed per the VDEQ specifications. And you have to add the part about state and local code, because there's really 3 criteria that have to be met. Every state has different requirements, and local code is different. And adding that the location is to be reasonably returned to its original condition. I don't know that much about oil tanks. I'll give you my general understanding. Again, the way Blakely trained me, we like to avoid problems. So if we're listing a house that has an oil tank, I always told my seller, hey, it's probably gonna be a problem, or it's gonna at least be an issue they want addressed. Have you properly abandoned your oil tank? If they say, I don't know, it was mom's house, I don't know what she did. I said, well, here's the thing, we've gotta disclose it, we've gotta disclose that it's there, and that we don't really know the status. We can wait and see if the buyer cares about it. Maybe you'll get lucky and they have an agent that isn't trying to protect them. But I used to tell my sellers, if you can afford to spend the $2 or $3 grand, let's get it checked out, let's get it properly dealt with now. That way we don't have a problem that comes up a week or 2 before closing when we're all ready to get this done. Now, some sellers say, no, I'm not dealing with it, it's their problem. So again, that just becomes a point of negotiation. You disclose it, and then you wait and see what comes up about who's gonna inspect it. It can be done as part of the home inspection. I got lucky on my first one because I didn't know what to look for. I think Kevin or somebody was teaching the home inspection class. You start learning to look for different pipes. You know, don't just walk around the yard when you're looking at property or at the home inspection. If there's a pipe coming out of the ground that you don't know what it is, ask the home inspector and then get it checked out. I mean, because Blakely says you can always tell if there's an underground tank. There's usually some evidence of it if you know what you're looking for. So get educated on that, and if you don't know, ask your home inspector to make sure they check if it's an older home. So if there could be a situation where it was properly abandoned, and if so, there should be a document somewhere. Either the owner has it, or you can, if you're the listing agent, you can check with the locality. In Hanover, for some reason, it's the fire chief that keeps those. Every county's different, but you can contact the DEQ and find out who keeps those records on file. So if it was properly filled or abandoned, somebody should have documentation somewhere. And then usually there's no problem. It was all taken care of. If that wasn't done, and as part of your inspection, you find out there's a little leak, and maybe it's not bad, it's just kind of right around the tank, that's when it costs the seller or the buyer, whoever, because it could be 2 to 5 grand, but you're gonna have to fix it. There is a super fund that deals with big leaks, and then there's still a deductible, and I do not know the dollar amount. I wanna say it's like 1,500 or two, it's still some money, it's not like it's free. But they cover the bulk of the cost, like if you've had something that has leached to the whole neighborhood or whatever, I don't even know if that's possible, but if there's a big problem, there is a fund. But again, all this slows down closings, so that's why I still revert to, let's figure this stuff out up front. But you may, as a buyer's agent, come across a house where it hasn't been dealt with. So that's when I think it's important to put some language in there to protect your buyer, saying, Mr. Seller, we want you to be responsible for any problems that come up with that oil tank.
Cindy, the one experience I did have in this regard in Virginia is half the house had oil, and you could see where that tank was. But the seller told me it wasn't the original oil tank. They knew there was another oil tank on the property somewhere. They had no idea where it was and no idea what had happened to it. What do you do about that? Now that you acknowledge that there is one somewhere.
As a listing agent, I think you disclose that, and then you decide, am I gonna proactively figure this out, or am I just gonna disclose it and then it becomes a part of your negotiation with any buyer, just like anything else. And I don't know how you go about finding it. I guess you call somebody like Pollard and they come out and give you a big bill for trying to find it.
Detector,
Yeah, so I don't know. But, especially if you're the listing agent, anything you're told like that, you have to disclose. This next one on here is, we saw it some when things are crazy, but people just immediately went to using people were just giving rent backs, and they used that possession by seller. I personally think this is a little weird, but we had people saying, I need you to give me 7 days to find a home, and if I can't find a home, I'm gonna be released from selling my house to you. That's what that one says. And then proof of funds. We talked about that, Keith, when we were talking about the cash sale.
Yeah.
Don't just put in there, buyer to provide proof of funds, put a date. And if you don't get it to me, we reserve the right to terminate. Because people can tell you anything on a Saturday afternoon when they're wanting to get under contract.
I had a question on the tanks. I guess propane tanks are just completely different. They
If
leak,
it's-
it's just a matter of fixing it, right? It's not a environmental hazard.
I think it's not the same. I'm not that knowledgeable. I would say anything that's underground.
Yeah, I think it's the underground.
It's the underground is the key piece, but
Yeah.
I don't know that propane is the same. I think oil tanks are more typically just abandoned.
Right.
But I'm not an expert.
Yeah, it's the underground ones.
Right.
Because they deteriorate over time, and it can be.
And there
harmful
can
to the
be
environment.
underground propane tanks.
Right.
And the propane is liquid in the tank. It
Yeah, so I would-
turns to gas when you turn it on.
I think it's probably
So it's
similar
still-
but different, but it's
yeah.
still something I think you'd wanna investigate.
Okay.
Alright, it is 10 minutes to 3. I have a really hard time teaching this class because I feel like everything is so situation specific, okay? So what I want you to take away is make it tight, alright? If, then, and if it's important, anything that's important needs to go in the contract. I don't care if they say, oh yeah, we're gonna move that junk. You want that junk moved, it's written in the contract, and it's a consequence of if it doesn't happen, alright? Do you all have any specific questions? Or tell me how this class, I feel like this is not our best class, okay? So what could I do differently? Or what do you need to know? What is the question, like what did you come here hoping to find out today?
I think you did a great job.
Yeah.
There's a lot to go over. So there's always gonna be something. There's 1,000 things that you could go over, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Is there anything that's happening in the market right now that is different that you haven't, that is something you feel like you need to know how to write in?
Well, inspections are back for a while there. So just, if you're younger than 2 years old in the business, when you first got in, you weren't really dealing with inspection language, and now you are, and when you see it, just sometimes people aren't specific enough, or they're not calling for action. They're just cutting and pasting from a report, and the language is very vague. Like you said, tighten it up. So if you want something done, make sure it's a verb and a is calling for action, it's not vague.
And I didn't read y'all all this, please read this, because there are some very specific examples addressing just what Justin said. You know, you can technically meet the terms of the contract by cutting and pasting, but then you're gonna end up with an argument. Be specific. I think on Shannon's page, she gave some examples. If you want the siding repaired, quote the picture in the inspection report, you know, say in picture 2A, the siding at the lower left window. I mean, the more specific, and say what you want done, you know, not just fix it or evaluate and repair as needed. That's the worst, because the seller's gonna think nothing needs to be repaired. So be very specific. Jeff, I'm sorry, Jeff, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, at what point do the addendums stop? Like, from, hey, I wanna buy your house, to we're closing tomorrow, when do they stop? Because, you know.
After closing.
Okay.
I
When
mean,
do
there are
you
sometimes
stop?
addendums done day of.
Right,
An example would be, you know, something that wasn't done the way it was supposed to be done, and maybe you're gonna get $500 more from the seller because they didn't fix this. I've had that happen.
okay,
I've kind of told my client, okay, we can either hold up closing, you know, and even if you do that day of, it's gonna hold up closing because they gotta run all the documents again. They gotta redo everything again.
right,
A lot of times names, addresses, we were talking about the estate thing. Sometimes those things get corrected right before closing if you've got the wrong name. Typically, okay, if things run smoothly, you've got your home inspection, there could be an addendum that's done after that. Appraisal, if it comes back with a problem, there could be an addendum done after that. There shouldn't be anything else on a normal transaction,
okay.
but all kinds of things, as you can imagine, can come up.
This is a question that's gonna be unique to me because of where I'm from. But, in a transaction where there are attorneys involved,
Mm-hmm.
do the attorneys ever or look for a way to rewrite any of this once they receive the paperwork? Does that happen in Virginia?
No. Now, if you have a client who's an attorney, yes. If you deal with an attorney as a client, there's a good chance they're gonna try to rip our contract apart.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of them do. They
Well, that was
they don't
normal.
like it, they want, you know, and that's where you've gotta be careful, cause they don't know what they're doing a lot of times, especially if they're not a real estate attorney. They just think, I mean, it's crazy some of the stuff we see.
Well, that was normal in New Jersey.
Yeah.
so.
But also remember, like I said, anything both parties want to agree to can be done. I see agents all the time getting hung up in, like, they'll call me over something very simple, like they've been told by the lender, hey, we need to add the buyer's name to the contract, or take the buyer, if there's two people, or take one of them off. They're calling me like, how do I do that? Like, you write a 1-sentence addendum that says all parties agree that this person is removed from the contract. My point is, there is no magic language. When you read Michael Lafayette's, this first thing, you're gonna read that and your head's just gonna go, oh, I don't know how to write that way, I don't write that way. You don't have to, okay? You do just have to be specific about what is supposed to happen. Action, as Justin was saying, what is supposed to happen, and the remedies or options if it doesn't happen. That's where you get into trouble. But there is no magic language. New construction all the time, they have to change the street address at the last minute, or like you said, you do end up giving another credit. You just write, seller agrees to credit this amount. There aren't magic words. The words just have to address the situation and be tight enough that you know what happens if the situation goes wacky. And remember, you're gonna come, and I talked about that one agent, you're gonna get clients who want to be protected against every single thing. You cannot do that. You just tell them, you know what, we can't predict how this is gonna go. We can do our best to control the knowns, and we're gonna make it as tight as we can, but, you know, people want foolproof. There is no such thing as foolproof when you're dealing with a bunch of humans who just get irritated and do
Think they know it all.
crazy things. Well, I hope it was a little helpful. I know it's overwhelming. It overwhelms me when I go to teach it, because I feel like you could spend a whole hour on each one of these things.
Yeah.
So take away, if then, make it tight, and get help, okay? Get help before you do it. Don't do it and then come in and want us to fix something that's now this gray mess that you got both sides just digging in their heels.
And I know where your office is.
Yep, yep. Well, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.